Ladies and gentlemen, thank you very much indeed for joining us at tonight's Brexit Central meeting. My name is Jonathan Isserby. I am the editor of Brexit Central. I hope you're all aware by now what Brexit Central is. It's a one-stop shop website for news, views, comment and analysis about everything that is happening relating to our departure from the European Union. We want to promote that optimistic and positive vision of our post-Brexit Britain. Now, I hope you're already all getting our morning briefing. If not, the instructions on how to receive it by email are up on the screen there. BrexitCentral.com/sign-up. Every morning you'll get into your inbox my personal message along with a roundup of all of today's news, views and comment about Brexit, and obviously follow us on Facebook and Twitter at Brexit Central. In the videos you just saw, there was mention of, well, there's a soundtrack indeed, the first one about heroes of the referendum campaign. One of those I should mention tonight is Richard Patient, who was the London chairman of Vote Leave, without whom tonight would not have happened. He's helped us put this on, so I hope you can show your appreciation to Richard. We have a very distinguished panel. I will introduce them one by one. And our first speaker tonight is John Longworth. John had a very distinguished career in business. He had stints as a director of both Tesco and Asda. In 2011, he became Director General of the British Chambers of Commerce. And at the very beginning of this year, he became the first leader of a major business group to declare his support for Brexit. Indeed, he felt so strongly about it that he resigned from his job in order to spend the campaign, specifically campaigning for a Leave vote as chairman of the Vote Leave Business Council. And indeed, this very morning, we published a piece from him on Brexit Central, the website, on his recipe for what he has called the Great British Great Off. John.
Well, thank you all for attending this session. Apologies to anybody who's heard some of what I'm going to say before, but I think it's worth repeating some things. We've decided to divide up the task of this panel session into various categories, and I'm going to cover business and the economy largely. 5 minutes, because I actually think Q&A is far more interesting than listening to talking heads. When I made my somewhat fateful speech at the British Chamber of Commerce conference on the 3rd of March this year, I said at the end of that speech that after Independence Day we would see a level of turmoil in the markets for a short period of time, that actually we would see the UK currency fall to a more realistic level, which would be helpful for business and exports, and that the real economy would be largely unaffected. And within a very short period, the markets would recognise that and return to normality. And that is exactly what has happened. And all the predictions of Armageddon have been disproved. What is more important, however, is what happens in the medium to long term. And I wanted just to say something about that, divided into 3 parts. First of all, the part that relates to the lead up to Brexit Day. So 2 years from March, or whatever date the Prime Minister sets to actually declare Article 50. During that period, we will enjoy in the UK an unprecedented opportunity, because we will have achieved, falling into our laps, we will have had a lower valuation to our currency, something that many other countries in the world are actually trying to engineer by other means. We will have an unprecedented opportunity to boost exports and the economy, and we should take that opportunity and max it out as much as possible, because we will have a lower currency valuation without anything else having changed. Obviously, confidence is key, and maintaining confidence in the economy during that period is going to be a very important role for the Bank of England and for the government. And they need to be very careful in the way in which they handle that period. And it's incumbent upon the institutions who said that things would be awful to actually recast their position. I wrote an article asking effectively whether the Bank of England were knaves or fools, and the Shakespearean sense, because if they change their mind, of course, they will be either described as having been foolish in the first place or having been knavish in their political machinations. Keynes said, of course, that when the circumstances change, when the facts change, I change my mind. And the way out for these institutions is really to say, actually, things have changed, and we now can take a different view of what the future holds. So maintaining confidence isn't too difficult a task if, in fact, organisations who manage the economy are prepared to do that. The second phase is what happens after Brexit Day. And a large part of the benefits of Brexit is actually nothing to do with the single market or even trade. The vast majority of the UK economy is actually domestic. And certainly the vast majority is domestic plus trade with the rest of the world. And we can actually hugely benefit from the Brexit dividend, the repatriation of net contribution, the use of the gross contribution in ways that we desire, the effective tax cut from business that would come from having deregulation, a proper deregulation programme. Those two things alone add up to 1.2% of GDP, which is a huge boost to growth. And actually then looking at what tariffs we can remove and how we can carry out trade deals around the world. And what we should do is use the period between now and Brexit Day to work on those things. The civil service should be working hard with business and the rest of the political economy to look at what things we can deregulate on Brexit Day +1. And we should also be looking at having informal discussions on trade with third countries around the world so that we are prepared immediately to crystallise the benefits of Brexit when we actually leave the European Union. And I'm quite taken with the IEA's suggestion that we should examine the possibility in the new Great Reform Act to actually introduce a sunset clause on all European legislation, thus reversing, in a sense, the burden of proof, so that Whitehall can't drag its feet on deregulation by saying it's having difficulty reviewing which should be removed, but instead saying all European legislation should be removed on a certain date unless we decide to keep it. And in that way, we can make sure there's a proper addressing of the deregulation issue. I'm old enough to have sat on Mrs. Thatcher's deregulation task force when I was a boy and I was naive. And that actual process, in my view, achieved very little. It was practically worthless because most of the significant reduction in regulation that could have been achieved was simply buried by the civil service. And the things that did emerge were a relatively worthless consequence. For example, the removal of the coat-hawks regulations. I remember very distinctly. And then the third phase of Brexit, finally, is to look at the relationship with the European single market. And one of the things that annoys me constantly about this debate is the use of the phrase access to the single market. The truth of the matter is that the vast majority of trade in the world takes place without any free trade arrangement whatsoever. There will always be trade between willing sellers and willing buyers. If the goods are the right quality or the services are the right quality and at the right price, trade will take place. Governments do not trade, they simply get in the way. The fact of the matter is, all the stuff that the US sells to the European Union, all of the stuff that China sells to the European Union is actually traded without any free trade arrangement or access to the single market. The truth is, everybody has access to the single market. It's only a question on what terms. And bearing in mind the average external tariff that the EU applies is only 3.5%, which is a fraction of the reduction in the currency valuation we've actually managed to achieve, then we should not fear not being in the single market. The advantages of the single market are a myth by comparison with the advantages that will accrue from Brexit. business and embracing free trade on a global scale. Thank you very much.
Thank you, John, very much. I should say, friends, by the way, that the most interesting Fringe meetings at a Conservative Party conference are always the ones where the government always stops to send a representative. And it's great to see Christine Harris in the front row. Our next speaker is Teresa Villas. I first met Teresa on the day of 1998 when she got selected as the lead candidate for London for the European elections of 1999. And then she served out in Brussels until 2005 when she became MP for Chipping Barnet, held a variety of posts in opposition on the front bench, and then in 2010 became Transport Minister, and then in 2012 became Northern Ireland Secretary, and was in the Cabinet for the following 4 years. Indeed, despite significant pressure from David Cameron, from the Irish government, and from all manner of other people to try and back David Cameron on the referendum campaign, she took a very principled and consistent stance, and she came out for leave, along with several other cabinet ministers. And in fact, just yesterday, again, I was delighted to publish a piece by Teresa on BrexitCentral.com, looking at some of the myths that were being propagated before the referendum, which haven't come true. Teresa.
Looking back over that campaign, I felt that one of the turning points of the referendum was when Sky's Faisal Islam asked David Cameron which would come first, World War III or the Brexit recession. And it was one of those moments where a few well-chosen words provide some really inescapable clarity, and I think it's no wonder that David Cameron found himself in some difficulty. And whilst we cannot yet be certain of what the long-term consequences of Brexit will be, I believe they'll be very bright, but we can't yet be certain, all the early signs are positive. So far, none of the disasters predicted by the Remainers have happened. Just let's reflect on a few of them that were thrown at us. The very day after the result, the French government reaffirmed the Le Touquet Treaty, so they're not sending our border guards home from Calais after all. Now, almost nobody is predicting the recession which the Remainers and the Bank of England tried to scare us with. The OECD, who warned of a major negative economic shock in April, have upgraded their growth projections for the UK. There's been good news from the ONS, there's been good news on manufacturing PMI figures, and the Treasury has reversed its gloomy post-referendum result forecast. The car industry enjoyed its highest August sales for 14 years, and Honda has announced plans to make Swindon its global hub for car exports. AstraZeneca and GSK have announced major investment in their UK operations. July saw 3.8 million tourists, or a record 2.5 billion into the UK economy in just 4 weeks. There's no sign of the spike in inflation that the Remainers were certain was on the way. The deficit is down, unemployment is down, our trade deficit in exports narrowed in July. And just think about it, by now we were supposed to be crawling around in the scorched earth of the Brexit conference. Thankfully, history has turned out to be somewhat different, but I think we also want to remember that the economy wasn't the only issue about which Remainers made some ominous predictions. One of the most irresponsible of all came from Tony Blair during his visit to Derry Londonderry. And his assertion was that a Brexit vote would undermine the Northern Ireland peace process. In my view, it was both irresponsible and, quite frankly, insulting to suggest that a vote to leave the European Union would mean that people in Northern Ireland would weaken or abandon their commitment to the fundamental principle that their future will only ever be decided by democracy and by consent and never by violence. It's a matter of deep regret that there still are criminal gangs in Northern Ireland who resort to terrorism, but they have virtually no public support, and there is no indication whatsoever that the referendum result has changed that in any way. And of course, throughout the campaign, Remainers routinely asserted that Brexit would mean the breakup of the United Kingdom. Well, wrong again on that score too. A recent BBC poll in Northern Ireland showed 63% wanting to remain in the UK and only 22% supporting the United Ireland. Results very little changed from when that same poll was conducted 3 years ago. Nor is there any evidence of a significant shift in opinion on Scottish separation either. The case for the union of England, Scotland, Wales and Northern Ireland remains as strong today as it has ever been. But then there was the Remain threat that the EU would punish us if we voted leave. And leaving aside the oddity of an organisation which purports to champion democratic values, punishing people for the way they voted, Article 8 of the European Treaty places a legal requirement on the EU to maintain good relations with neighbouring states to secure, I quote, an area of prosperity and good neighbourliness. Yes, there may be a few hardliners in the Commission who may talk in hostile terms, but even Guy Verhofstadt, the arch-federalist appointed to the EU's Brexit negotiating team, even he acknowledged that the UK's exit process shouldn't be about punishment and revenge. Addressing the European Parliament, he shared a simple truth that the EU needs to make a success of this process for the sake of the citizens of the remaining EU. And no one would benefit from a trade war. The UK is a key trading partner for those 27 remaining EU member states, and Civitas recently estimated that at least 6 million jobs across those member states are linked to business with the UK. So it is in the interest of both sides of that forthcoming negotiation to reach a deal which maximises the opportunities for trade between the EU and the UK. And that, I believe, is what the UK government now has the opportunity to deliver. But looking back now on the campaign and polling research carried out since the result, it seems that people just didn't believe Project Fear. But the debate continues on what did motivate people to vote leave. In considering that question, I'd like to refer to a second, rather less high-profile broadcasting moment during the campaign. And that, for me, took place on the Stephen Nolan show. Now, I imagine not many of you here will have heard BBC Ulster's daily dose of radio phone-in confrontation and controversy. But on this particular occasion, a Remain supporting MLA was asked to name a European Commissioner. And guess what? She struggled. Like the vast majority of people in this country, she couldn't name a single solitary one. And of course, a key point in the Leave campaign that we had to get across is to make sure people understood that EU membership means vesting supreme lawmaking power in people we do not elect and we cannot remove. What that incident on the Stephen Nolan show demonstrated is that not just that, it means vesting this power in people we cannot even name and have never even heard of. A concerted effort has been made to portray Leave voters as ignorant, prejudiced, reactionary or worse, with all the arrogance of the left-wing establishment. But the decision to leave the EU is not symptomatic of a nasty, inward-looking or Little Englander mentality. People voted to leave because they wanted more control over our laws, our money and our borders. Democracy was what the referendum was all about. That was the case I made throughout, that was the case Vote Leave made throughout. Until we leave the EU, no matter who we elect to Westminster, there are many things we simply cannot change. As President Juncker candidly put it, there is no democratic choice against the EU treaties. Well, as Dan Hannan reminded us in his memorable speech to the Spectator debate during the referendum, 350 years ago, we fought a civil war in this country to defend the principles that no law shall be made nor taxes raised except by our own elected representatives. And ladies and gentlemen, from these small islands at the far northwestern edge of Europe, we have exported the principle of independent self-governing government across the seas to the four corners of the planet. And on the 23rd of June, the people of this great country seized the opportunity that they were given to restore our freedom and take back control of making our own laws once again. The Remainers did all they could to talk our country down, and they're still doing it. At the heart of their argument was the claim that somehow we are too small, too weak and too stupid to govern ourselves and stand on our own 2 feet. Well, we here in this conference know that they were wrong. We are a great country, we've got so much going for us. We're the 5th largest economy in the world, we're the 4th largest military power in the world, with the best armed services on the planet. The soft power reach of our popular culture is unrivaled. We have the biggest and best financial centre in the world, some of the greatest manufacturers. We speak the international language of business. Our legal system is trusted almost beyond any others. We have some of the greatest scientists and the greatest universities. We can stand on our own 2 feet and we can thrive. I believe that we can look forward to a bright future outside the European Union as we regain our freedom and become an independent, self-governing democracy once again, and I am proud to have played even a small part in making that happen. Thank you.
He has fought for what he called British independence, fomenting, protesting, strategizing, undermining, writing books, writing speeches, and then delivering them without notes. That was part of a profile of Dan Hannan in last Thursday's Guardian, which is still online, obviously, and I highly recommend you read it. So it's a fantastic picture of the man. Dan was a student back in the early 1990s when John Major signed the Maastricht Treaty. Dan responded by founding the Oxford Campaign for an Independent Britain. And I think barely a day, perhaps maybe even an hour, has passed since that moment when he has not done something to help the effort towards fighting for British withdrawal from the European Union. He was elected to Brussels on the same day as Theresa back in 1999, and generally fought his corner as a kind of independent-minded backbencher, as a newspaper columnist, rather than as a frontbench politician, if you like. But he was instrumental in getting the Conservatives out of the Federalist European People's Party and forming the new group, which everyone said it never happened, couldn't be done, but I think there's now, 18 different parties in it. Fantastic job. And in that Guardian profile, there's a great quote from the Marquess of Salisbury, no less, who said of Dan, "You've got to have hard asses who are morally courageous, who consistently make the arguments, and who don't mind being unfashionable." Well, we welcome Dan Hannan, a man who helped make Brexit fashionable.
Jonathan, thank you very much. 24th of June has always had a special significance. It was the day when, in the year 2000, a sweet-natured young woman, looking radiant, agreed to become my wife. But now, the 24th of June has an extra special significance. Because the 24th of June, and I'm afraid that Mrs. H is going to find that all of our anniversaries from now on are Independence Day parties, the 24th of June is the day that we decided to become a self-governing democracy once again. And I'm proud of all the people who made that happen, and at some cost in many cases. You just heard Theresa, with characteristic honesty, saying that she might have been glad to have played a small part in making it happen. Theresa didn't play a small part. It was Theresa who first went to the Prime Minister as a cabinet minister and said, "I can't support this deal." Had she not done so, it's far from clear to me that the Prime Minister would have allowed sitting ministers to campaign on either side. Certainly that announcement would not have been made early enough to tempt a number of them to do it. I think Theresa can fairly claim to have influenced the result. Likewise, John, the first significant business figure to give up a position, being fired, in effect, from the chambers of commerce in order to take up this cause. And so many people that I can see in the audience. My friend Amjad Bashir, who campaigned tirelessly to put himself out of work among particularly the Asian communities in Yorkshire and Lancashire. He's now having a good kip and he's earned one. Peter Cruddas, I can put them all back to people who stepped forward and funded the thing when we desperately needed it. And the thing that all of those people, and all of you who I can see who were part of the campaign have in common, is this. Not a single one of you was hoping for any In some cases, quite the contrary. There may have been people, particularly some of our political and business supporters, who were forfeiting honours or even government contracts that might have come that way because they were prepared to take this one. Every single person who worked for or donated to the Vote Leave campaign could only have been motivated by unadorned, uncomplicated patriotism. And if you were in that category in this room, from the bottom of my heart, thank you. It was an extraordinary moment. For once, the phrase "against all the odds" is literally apt. On the day of the vote, implied odds provided by the voters was translated into an 82% chance of a leave vote, 82% chance of the remainder. And unsurprising, when we think of the sheer asymmetry of the forces. Vote Leave was taking on the leaders of all the main parties, all the broadcasters, all the trade federations, BMA, NFU, CDI, TUC, every international think tank, every university, every Brussels-funded quango or charity or NGO, every foreign government from whom David Cameron or George Osborne could call in a favour. To describe this campaign as David versus Goliath doesn't begin to do justice to the imbalance of forces. Imagine that Goliath had got a little bit nervous, had sent back to Gath for reinforcements. Got a gang of 50 or 100 Philistine spearmen together, rushed at the little shepherd boy en masse, and bum, 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 they'd all gone down with stones in their foreheads one after another. That would have been a little bit closer to the kind of odds that we were facing. So it's no surprise, in a sense, that when we woke up on that aptly sunny Friday morning on the 24th of June, even some of us who had voted Leave felt a little bit shell-shocked, a little bit numb. Shall I tell you what that numbness was, my friends? It was the shock of being back in control again. It's the feeling of the bedridden convalescent who after weeks is finally able to walk over, throw open the French windows, and stride into the sunlight. It was the shock of the long-term prisoners who, after years of being told when to eat, when to exercise, suddenly finds that he's making his own decisions. Because on that day, we decided to defy all of the experts, all of the political establishment, to say that we didn't like the choices that had been repeatedly put in front of us by a narrow political elite, that we wanted a different menu of options, and that if our current leaders weren't going to provide them, we were going to send them away in advance for something. And as we've just said, we were right to make that call. How quickly all of those expert judgments were shown to be false. 10 financial institutions, by my count, have now uprated their forecasts since after the Brexit vote. The OECD and the IMF, as well as these 10 banks, have all now shifted their position since June. Right? This is not some... I've noticed how many of my Remain friends have slid very quickly from saying back in July, oh, this is all a disaster because of Brexit, to now in September, October saying, yeah, but Brexit hasn't actually happened yet. Sorry, guys. That was not your prediction. What you were saying was that the very act of voting to leave would cause an immediate financial shock. And what actually happened? Look, we just heard that the charge sheet from the former Northern Ireland Secretary, you know, the immigration officers not being thrown out of Calais. We were told by the German finance minister who was brought over to London and he said, you will be treated as any third country. Out means out, he said. And then he gave an interview in Welt am Sonntag, and he said, well, of course, we'll have a special relationship with Britain. And the astonished interviewer said, but Herr Minister, you said out is out. You used the English phrase. Yeah, he said, George Osborne told me to say that. I'm not making it up. Welt am Sonntag, check it out. And so the list goes on. You know, the emergency budget that didn't happen, the £4,300, 71% of economists surveyed by Reuters were predicting a recession in 2016. How's that working out? We were told that if we voted to leave, there would be a collapse in the stock exchange. We weren't told that it would be the Italian stock exchange. People, when are still a few holdouts. There are still Remain campaigners sending out gloomy prognostications like some defeated resistance movement in an occupied capital. But I'm glad to say that the vast majority of Remain voters have accepted the result with equanimity. Don't make the mistake of thinking that social media, or even broadcast media, are typical of the country as a whole. Stare into that vortex for long enough and you will be dragged into sheer madness. Most people, I think, now want to make this work. The early indications, as Teresa said, are hopeful. And we now have a huge opportunity to exploit some of the openings that have been put in front of us by the decision we've made. Now, if you've heard me speak today, you'll have heard me say already that there are three aspects to getting Brexit right. One is what relationship do we have with the other 27 countries. Two is what relationship do we have with the 165 countries that are not in the EU and that will be responsible for 95% of the economic growth on this planet in the 21st century. And three, what changes do we have to make at home? What are our domestic reforms aimed at maximising our opportunities? Now, number one, look, I think that's the easiest and the most straightforward. I think we will end up with a free trade relationship which will be a little bit closer than that. Right? It won't just be a free trade agreement, it won't just be like South Korea or something. We will have closer institutional ties reflecting our geography, our history, and our common interests. Of course, we have a continued interest as a country in the success of our 27 EU partners. They're not just our allies, they're also our suppliers and our customers. And I think, in fairness, let's be reasonable about this, it was a close result, right? 48-52, it's not a massive mandate for a severing of all links. It's a mandate for a phased repatriation of power within the context of continuing military security and commercial ties. I think it is possible to satisfy most people. I'm much more interested in numbers 2 and 3. Trade with the vast majority of countries in the world. Now, the Prime Minister has set out this elevated, exalted vision of Britain becoming once again the leader of free trade. Don't think that this is just a question of economic policy, getting the rules right. Free trade ought to be the great moral crusade of our era. Trade is the optimal instrument of poverty alleviation, conflict resolution, and of social justice. Free trade will be the first G7 country that can open its markets across the range, including in agriculture and textiles. Think of the advantages that will accrue to developing countries when a country in that category opens its economy. And think of the advantages that will accrue to the lowest income people in this country when we no longer penalise them through quotas and tariffs aimed at protecting vested interests here. It's far more important that we get that right. Free trade with the EU will look after itself. We're starting from that default position already. Using the opportunities we have now to have untrammeled commerce with the world, that's something that could have planetary significance and could raise the entire human species to a new level of wealth and happiness. If we're going to make a success of it, we also need to make the right domestic reforms. We need this to be the country that the whole world wants to come and do business in. Now, some of those domestic reforms will flow naturally from Brexit. Leaving the EU means we can have cheaper food. It means we can have cheaper energy. And we need to make sure that we maximise and optimise those advantages. It means we can have a different and more business-friendly regulatory environment. It means we can opt out of some of the most harmful and expensive regulations. But there's a bunch of things we need to do that aren't really directly related to Brexit, but that we now have a pretty unique opportunity to secure. I'm talking about things like getting a welfare system that encourages work and increases productivity, having lower, flatter and simpler taxes, having cheaper housing, having the right infrastructure, all the things we need to do to make sure that business wants to come to this country. We're in an unfrozen moment. And an unfrozen moment is as much attitudinal as institutional. People want to make a success of this. To repeat, don't think that the Ramonas on Twitter are typical of the vast majority of the 48%. People want this to work. I think there's even a sense that there are some people watching us to see whether we stumble. And that gives people a sense of resolve, of wanting to show that we can make a success of it. So we have this opportunity to set the dial, to get the right a long-term success of independence. Unfrozen moments don't last forever. Attitudes will congeal again soon enough around a new set of assumptions. So this is the absolutely critical time, next couple of years, to make the changes in our regulatory system, trading arrangements, and in our domestic structures to make this the most competitive economy in the region. To return to being the great merchant entrepreneur that we traditionally did. All we need is the confidence to do it. Think of what we've achieved. Think of how extraordinary was that achievement 3 months ago. That was the end of the deal. The real task now is making a success, so that instead of walking out into that sunny garden and then sitting in terror on the doorstep, we're able to breathe the deep sense of the sunny meadow and to look beyond the confines of it and see in all the full spectrum of colour the glories of global creation. Everyone suddenly burst out singing, and I was filled with such delight as prison birds must find in freedom, winging wildly across the white orchards and the dark green fields. On, and out of sight.
I'm just wondering what the panel thinks the priority number one for Britain should be in terms of deregulation or the controls on immigration should be more actually out of the EU. And I'd also be interested in what they think the biggest concern is for Britain outside the EU, what could go wrong.
Yes. Would you be prepared to sacrifice the promise to control immigration if the EU are very stubborn about it?
Yeah, I'm interested in the approach of some of the media are a bit surprised for a while that we're making a success of this when most of us got what we voted for. But as a negotiating position for the EU, Brexit, do you think that we could calm some of our exporters by offering to feed some of the potential trade tariffs that we're going to charge, if there are tariffs charged, back to our exporters to offset the costs of importing into Europe? In other words, calm down the likes of this, and I've just said they may put a £3 billion investment on Poland. If Theresa May announced that actually, don't worry chaps, we'll make sure you don't have to bear that cost, and you've got 10% reduction in the pound, so you can actually deal it in Europe. Do you think that's a useful negotiating position?
I mean, just taking the last thing first, about half the net contribution we make to the EU most of the terms that we have to be really careful about special pleading by individual companies in individual sectors that go into these things, because all corporates gain circumstances, and of course we want to get the best out of it. The ideal situation for me would be to actually use the allowances we have and the funding we have to make the economy as a whole attractive to business development, more attractive than anyone else. In actual fact, we will solve much of our export problem, which is a problem for us. The trade deficit is very significant and not and worse still, the current account deficit is unsustainable, which is why we're constantly having to sell our assets to pay for it. We can't sustain that. If we make the UK economy the best place in the world to do business, business will, as you saw, without any other activities.
That was
forward in the way that our continental competitors do, what the Americans do, and if we take all these things in combination, I think we'll get a good result for everybody. It's also worth remembering on the automobile sector, which is one of the biggest areas, 10% finished car, 30% components. It's complicated because we put the important components as well. Looking at it simplistically, at the margins, what's the worst that could happen if actually you have this reciprocal tariffs applied in both directions? The UK currency is so much less in value than it was on the 20th of June that actually we've already eliminated the vast majority of any tariffs that the continental Europeans could apply. So our cars are still as cheap as they were for continental consumers. By contrast, their cars will be more expensive in the UK. So at the margins there will be winners and losers, because what consumers do in the UK very likely is buy a few less German cars, a few more British manufactured cars elsewhere. And that seems to be not a bad proposition actually, if that's the worst case.
Could the panel get nearer to their microphone, please?
Go ahead.
I apologise if you couldn't hear me.
Do you want to take the question about the union and the one about your priorities or concern?
I think I might have to the question about the union repeated because I think I might have missed that. But on the priorities for looking at EU regulation, I think that in many areas, the divergence process between us and the rest of the EU will be slow. It'll take a while for us to work out exactly what our priorities are. But I think we need to look soon and with some urgency at farming and fisheries. Because even where we share some of the goals of current EU regulation, of course we want to keep our food safe, of course we want high standards of animal welfare, of course we want financial support for farmers, of course we want sustainable fishing practices, but the sheer volume and complexity of the regulation of those sectors, I'm sure we can come up with a system which delivers our regulatory goals in a much simpler way. I think one of the most sort of challenging tasks ahead is the future of the city. I mean, I think the city has reinvented itself and many times adapted to change, and I believe it will continue to be the biggest and best financial centre, not just in Europe but in the world. But there are some difficult trade-offs that we may have to consider on whether we would sacrifice controlling immigration for single market access. I don't think that we need to make that sacrifice. I think it's perfectly possible to take back control of our immigration and come to a sensible arrangement on trade. It's difficult to reconcile that control of immigration with being a member of the customs union. We won't have the status in the single market that we have as a member, but as John has very clearly pointed out, there are many ways in which we can do business with the EU which don't involve membership, don't involve the customs union. The EU has free trade agreements with 50 countries and only 3 of them include free movement.
Dan, do you want to respond to
What's the biggest priority, the first priority? I would say to change our regulatory and trade system away from the model of standardization and towards the model of mutual product recognition. So, what do I mean by that? When we leave the EU, let me pluck an example more or less around. When we leave the EU, we will presumably have some kind of medicines agency that decrees which pharmaceuticals may be sold here. The foundational instruction to that agency should be, do not reinvent the wheel. If it's good enough for the FDA, it's good enough for us. If it's good enough for the European Medicines Agency, it's good enough for us. Right? We have protections in common law. People are already protected against mis-selling, against tort. So don't allow cartels of producers to use the regulatory system to raise barriers to entry, which is what really happens when people get their hands on lobbying, right? So, and by the way, if you're working in that new British Medicines Agency and we catch you using the phrase precautionary principle, you're immediately fired, because that is always the cover for some cartel wanting to preserve a protected share of the market against innovators and startups. The question on immigration, it's very telling the way you put it. You said, would we sacrifice this if the EU was stubborn about it? I mean,
You know, there are lots of countries that want to have easier access for their nationals to the UK. They can be as stubborn about it as they like. But once we're an independent country, it's not really up to them. Right? The question is, what is the right policy for us? Now, we made it very clear in the campaign, I campaigned, on the promise of taking back control. Generally, across the board. By the way, I've got a general rule on this. I've noticed this. If somebody tells you Brexit was all about immigration, you are talking to a Remain voter. It's an absolutely 100% fail-safe rule. Actually, I put it out on Twitter a couple of weeks ago, I said this, and I got literally more than 100 replies saying, no, it was all about immigration, you racist liar. Every single one from a Remain voter, which was exactly the point that I was setting out to prove. What people were voting for was to take back control across the board, one aspect of which is border control, but there were many more important ones to do with democracy, the economic situation, and so on. We will, of course, having taken back control, as a bilateral arrangement, as an independent country, want to reach sensible arrangements with friendly countries, which include measures of reciprocal entitlements to study and work. I don't think there's anyone who voted Leave who was expecting that there would be zero immigration. In fact, the polls tell us that. These people only exist in the fantasies of some Remain campaigns. So we're going to do that, but it'll be on the basis that we decide on what terms and roughly in what numbers. And actually, I think a good early move should be that in key industries, financial services and pharmaceuticals, this government should make it easier to hire qualified workers from anywhere in the world, whether from the EU or from Brazil or Indonesia or whatever. Something which, if the polls are to be believed, is supported by 88% of the British people. They say they want more skilled workers here. That was never what was at issue in the campaign. Finally, just on tariffs, I'm amazed that the broadcasters in particular are spending so much time discussing this when not a single mainstream politician on either side of the channel is seriously proposing tariffs. Why are we fretting about a scenario that literally no one in any position of authority is proposing?
More hands. I can see the Ulsterman on the end of that road.
Looking for allies in the negotiation with the members of the European Union, would the members of the panel, especially Theresa, agree that ironically the Republic of Ireland that didn't want us to leave in the UK could be one of our best friends in negotiating a good deal because of our special relationship? And secondly, not just for Theresa but relevant to her, when we become an independent nation again in 27 months' time, should corporation tax, that incentive for business, not be centralised in Westminster and down to a 10% incentive rate rather than the trend in recent years of devolving corporation tax to different parts of the UK?
Well, gentlemen, does that?
Thank you. I have a question concerning agriculture. It's quite clear that the farming community will continue to receive grants as they have been doing so in the past. Does the panel feel that those should be redirected to encourage more food production rather than simply land management so that we can produce more of our own food, reducing the need to import and reducing the burden on the balance of payments?
And also, I had a question over Twitter, which I'll use. I'll show I'm in touch with my tweeting from Chris Stewart, my good friend from York City Council, who says, which EU countries do the panel think will be next to leave the European Union? John, do you want to go first again?
Well, we're just taking the agriculture one, of course. So there's a big debate they had around what we're going to do with tariffs generally. Can you hear me, by the way? Yeah, tariffs generally. Patrick Minford, of course, the famous economist, has suggested actually we simply remove all tariffs. That would, of course, remove any leverage we have on trade negotiations elsewhere. So I think that we have to treat caution, while it might be an objective long term, and agricultural tariffs are no exception. I agree with you. I mean, actually having more production in the UK would be a jolly good idea from the point of view of balance of trade. There are lots of products that we simply cannot produce in the UK easily, or that we cannot produce enough of. And actually easing tariffs on those product areas would help everybody and would not at least be a problem to UK farmers, quite frankly. I think I'll leave it to Theresa to answer the question about the island of Ireland. Was there anything else? You want to get on the corporation tax? I mean, corporation tax. How's it going? Corporation tax reduction is one of the measures that the UK government can consider to help make the UK economy one of the best places in the world to do business. But there are many other aspects of the UK economy, ranging from infrastructure and digital connectivity and the way in which investment is treated, the way in which our is treated, stimulating the growth of small businesses to become medium-sized and big businesses in the future, access to finance. There are a myriad of things that the government actually could do to make the UK the #1 place in the world to do business. Quite a number of those things, by the way, were promised by the last Chancellor, but were never delivered. So I hope that actually this impetus that Brexit has given and the focus that Brexit has given to the new administration will actually drive us down a path where we do actually, in practice, become the best economy in the world to do business.
I think you're right. I am optimistic that the Irish government will be allies in this negotiation. They will have their own interests to protect, and the reality is that the economies of our two countries are hugely interconnected in many senses. We're a single economic zone. So if there was any kind of negative outcome of the exit process for the United Kingdom, that would be likely to have an even greater impact on the Republic of Ireland. So I'm
they're probably being incredibly sceptical about the European Union, which just told them how it should be sending its tax rates, which I think has gone down like a cold sea.
Well, I have to say that there's still a high degree of enthusiasm and support for the European Union in Ireland. So I don't think there's a dramatic change even after the tax case. But I would hope that the UK and Irish governments can work together, because it's in the interests of both sides of this forthcoming negotiation that we have a positive outcome. In terms of corporation tax devolution, I still think that could be potentially very positive for Northern Ireland. I'm not convinced that centralising it is necessary, but certainly corporation tax reductions at a national level could be an important part of improving the offer to inward investors. In response to the question on farm support, I think this is one of the big advantages of leaving the EU, that we can start to make decisions and have a proper debate about how we support our farmers. I think that a big switch back to production rather than a focus on land management comes with certain risks. We don't want to end up with excess production, but we can have this debate now. It's well worth considering. In terms of whether other countries will leave, I'm not convinced that there are countries lining up for the exit dribble, partly because I don't think many governments will consider having a referendum. I think that we've learned from the example that we set. Traditionally, the Danes have been alongside us in their scepticism about the European Union, so if anyone might leave, I would say it would be them, but I don't see anyone any exit to be imminent at the moment.
I'll take the farming question first, but I'm afraid I'm going to disappoint the questioner. First of all, I think a huge and undersold advantage of Brexit will be much cheaper food, because if food moves towards world rather than European prices, there will be gains of hundreds of pounds a year. One calculation was nearly £900 a year for the average family. Something, by the way, that we didn't really make anything of during the campaign, because people are so cynical about politicians that however we phrased it, in every focus group, people say, yeah, you've always said that. No one was primed to accept that message. So this is if you like, an unlooked for bonus now, that groceries will be significantly cheaper. In that situation, if suddenly we're opening our markets to delicious Argentine steak and all the rest of it, you can't then also expect our farmers to do without direct support. The question becomes, what is the most efficient way of getting support to our farmers with minimum cost to the taxpayer and maximum advantage to the farmer? And I think the cheapest system, and I'm not going to pretend that it's the justest or the fairest or the most progressive, but it's by far the cheapest to administer, is you have a straightforward acreage-based grant. No inspections, no fretting about land quality, no different definitions, no late payments, in fact nothing, just an annual payment in return for the land not being turned into housing or golf courses or whatever. It's a way that we acknowledge that the stewardship of the countryside is looking after a common resource, a commonwealth, on behalf of all of us. And that's why every country in the world, except Australia and New Zealand, does it. So I think that would be the trade-off. I suspect that the grant could be quite a lot higher than now. If we take the money that we're paying under the Common Agricultural Policy, you just kept that and divided it up, I think I worked out it would be somewhere between 90 and £100 an acre, which is substantially more than people are getting now. And also it would be acres, because we'll be outside the European Union, so we'll be able to deal with acres again. But the flip side is there will be cheaper food, and I think our farmers have always traditionally been more innovative, more open to technology than the EU. I think that they will thrive and will get new markets overseas, outside the European Union, as part of the trade deals that we'll make. Just very quickly on the what next question. This came up at the last Fringe meeting that I was doing, and a Dutch friend of mine who was on the panel was very, very keen that the Netherlands should be the next country to leave. He said he'd been having this conversation with a Danish friend and an Irish friend, and they said we wanted to take a bet on it, but nobody would accept a bet in euros because we all thought it would be devalued by then.
Thank you very much indeed. I'm afraid, friends, the clock has beaten us. It's about to strike 7. I know that Dan has an appointment with Channel 4 News, and there are other engagements that people have to get to. So all that remains is to thank you for coming. Please do look at BrexitCentral.com every day. Sign up for those emails. Take the lanyards where they pride. And please, to John, Teresa, and Dan.
I've been here.